Do you ever see someone's art and think, damn, I wish I could render like that? Yeah, me too. Honestly, I still do sometimes, but after a ton of trial and error, I've learned what actually makes shading and color click. So in this video, I'll share the key ideas, tips and mindset that help you improve your rendering. This is not a step-by-step tutorial, but the things that help you understand why things look good. These are all the topics that we'll cover today, and you can find the timestamps in the description, so feel free to jump to whichever part you want. Rendering takes time and practice, but this should make the journey a lot smoother. Alright, let's start with the basics. To explain shading, we have to talk about bones. Yeah, the sphere example. You've probably seen it before, but it's still the easiest way to understand light. The first rule is that you have to pick a light direction. Everything that is facing the closest to the light source will become brighter, whilst the rest of the shape will gradually come into shadow until reaching complete darkness. If we were to see it with a square, for instance, you will see how these faces are the brightest because they have the most direct line of sight with the light source, but the rest are darker depending on how well the light source can reach them. The top, for instance, in this example will be the darkest because the light source isn't actually reaching there. If you have multiple light sources, always shade as if only one exists first, then add the other ones later. Since my light comes from the side, the sphere will look like this, simple and clean. Now, the shape and softness of a shadow depend on the surface. Rounded objects have softer edges, and hard-edged objects have sharper shadows. This concept also applies for casted shadows as well, which should reflect the shape of the object that is being casted on. Additionally, just like how light seeps through a window, the part of the shadow that's farthest from the light source, in this case, the window, becomes softer or blurrier. Even if the object itself has hard edges, the shadow edge can still fade out as it gets farther away. You can use this to show both the distance of your light source and the intensity of your lighting. Sharper edges mean closer or stronger light, while softer ones suggest distance or diffuse light. You can use both hard edge and soft edge shadows so that the most rounded parts of a shadow are blurred, while the rest isn't. How much you wish to combine these methods is up to you, just don't blur everything, it would look muddy. Now most people stop there, but there's another type of shadow, called ambient occlusion. It's the darkest area where two surfaces meet, because light can barely reach there. You'll see it where the sphere touches the table or between two objects that are close together. I like to paint this with a soft airbrush, but if your style is more anime-like, like cel shading with hard edges, that works too. Okay, so that's cool, but now let's add some bounce light. This happens when light hits a surface and softly reflects onto nearby areas. It's weaker and softer than the main light and usually carries the color of the surface it bounced from. For example, on a white table, like in the example here, the bottom of a gray sphere gets a faint white glow. But if the table were to be red, for instance, this bounce light would also be a very dim red. So there's another type of bounce, quote unquote, called ambient light. It's the overall color of the environment softly filling your shadows. For example, a character under a blue sky will have slightly blue, cooler shadows, while in a forest, those shadows shift to green. In practice, ambient light sets the general mood of your shadows. Now, when I say mood, I'm referring to how warm or how cool a color would be, while bounce light adds localized color from nearby surfaces. Together, they create an illustration that is more believable and has more of a natural look. And don't worry, I will explain later what are warm and cool colors. Now, regarding highlights, these are the bright spots where the light hits directly. They tell us where the light source is and what the material is made of. When you have sharp or small highlights, this could help represent a glossy or wet surface. When the highlights are soft or they're wide, this can maybe represent some type of matte surface. You place them where the light hits strongest, which is at the point most directly facing the light source or at edges turning toward the light. You keep them controlled and boom, instant realism. Highlights can also be used to define texture, depending on how scattered or the shape that they have. Just make sure to not overdo the highlights because then your character or the certain scene is gonna look like it's very oily or wet. Now, most artists shade by starting with light and then adding the shadows. I actually do the opposite. I apply a darker tone first, then I paint light on top depending on the light direction. Both work, but try each and see which feels natural to you. Now, this theory applies to more than spheres. You gotta think about cubes, cylinders, and cones. When shading complex things like the human body or a face, simplify first. Imagine an arm as a cylinder. Shape it that way first and then carve in the muscle shapes. Same with faces. Think of them as a bunch of planes catching light differently. The rule is simple. Shade the basic form first, then refine on top of it. You start broad, but then you sculpt with light. And there's one more step that I will show you later, which is something that will make your shadows pop even more, which is spoiler, it's called the Terminator line. But first, I would like to explain this. Generally speaking, there are three main ways to shade and render. You have value-based shading, layer blending modes, and color picking or direct color rendering. I personally use mostly the last two, but honestly every professional artist mixes them all. If you're not trying to paint the Mona Lisa but you just want to make sure your rendering looks better, here's what you need to know. Value-based shading. This one is about values, as the name suggests, of course, which means how light or dark a color is. You shade your illustration using only black and white and everything else in between, i.e. grays. This helps you focus purely on contrast and lighting before worrying about color. Now, why is this important? This is important because different colors have different values even at the same saturation. For example, at full saturation, a blue square is actually darker than a red square. And that is why value is so important. It's all about contrast, not detail, because it is contrast that makes your art stand out. To practice, finish your flat colored drawing. You add a color layer on top filled with white to turn it into grayscale. Then you shade on top of it only using grays, blacks, and whites. Then copy your base colors and put that layer above everything else. Set that layer to color blending mode, or you could use gradient maps if your program has them to be able to return the color back into your illustration. And that way you get your colors back with your values intact. Though it may look a little bit desaturated at first or a little bit muddy, don't worry, that can be fixed with some layer corrections. If you're wondering what I did, I simply lowered the values of the robe with a level correction layer. You can also use a multiply blending mode layer with a gray tone for this. Then I made the skin a bit more cyan color with a color correction layer. Then I added an orange accent color so it contrasts better. Then the Terminator, which we will talk about in a second. Then a blue backlight. And then I just made the highlights redder with the color balance correction layer. Now, when using gradient maps, things work a little bit differently. They're especially useful if you started your painting in grayscale, since you might not have decided on your colors yet. Gradient maps let you assign colors based on your existing values, and the best part is you can actually change those colors anytime without affecting the shading underneath. Now, being fully honest, I don't really use them very often, so my result here is imperfect, but generally speaking, this is how they work. You start off by making a new correction layer. In Clip Studio Paint, this correction layer can be found here at the top and then under correction layer. And there you'll be able to find the gradient map. Here you will be able to see not only a presets of already pre-existing gradient maps, but also a bar at the top which represent the colors that are going to be applied on your values. The right side represents the bright values, so from grays all the way going on to white. And on the left side it represents the darker values, so from the grays going all the way to black. Over the whole line that you're able to see in between, you're able to make a click and then assign another arrow to it. This means that you're able to replace the color that is stated in this particular value for any color that you wish for. And this can be done across the whole value map, which will be the bar here. And then here I am adding the rest of the gradient maps for the skin and the hair and the same effects I had for the previous method. Now you will notice that some correction layers actually have lower opacities, so please remember that you can always do that until you are satisfied with the result. Then there is also blending mode shading. This one is a little bit more direct. You can use layer blending modes to shade or highlight over your colors. For shadows, for example, I like to use the multiply layer blending mode. And for highlights, I like to use the overlay or hard light. How they exactly work, I don't really know. For me, it's more like a blending mode goes brrr, but the way you use it is by first picking a color as a base, then you set the blending mode, and then you paint inside of this blending mode. And if the colors feels too intense or maybe too saturated, you can always lower the opacity. I like keeping my shading colors close to the middle of the color wheel, slightly desaturated, so I can push the saturation later on where I want the viewer to look, or in other words, the focal point of the illustration. Now we get to my favorite part. Color. I'm no color theory scientist, but here's what really matters, in my opinion, of course. In a color wheel, the circle right here is called hue. In other words, what color you are picking. The vertical plane controls values, how bright or dark a color is, and the horizontal plane controls the saturation. Colors can feel warm or cool depending on the emotion and temperature they suggest. Warm colors like red, orange, or yellow, they represent like sunlight, fire, warmth in general. And the cool colors, like blue, green, and purple, they represent calmness, distance, or coldness. And here's the key rule. Warm light creates cool shadows, and cool light creates warm shadows. That contrast is everything. But here's where most people get confused. A color can be warm or cool even within its own family. For example, not all blues are cold. A blue that leans towards purple, like ultramarine, feels warmer, while a blue that leans towards green, like cyan, feels colder. Same goes for reds. A red leaning toward yellow, like scarlet, feels hot, but the one leaning towards blues, like crimson or magenta, feels cooler. So when you're rendering, think relatively. What's warm or cool depends on what surrounds it and what kind of light you're using. That's how you keep your colors feeling balanced and alive instead of muddy. Now, the color wheel, I believe, can be divided into different sections. You've got your base colors, your shadow colors, your highlight colors, and your accent colors, and I'll talk about those in a second. Now, remember, this is just a general guideline. Your base color can sit anywhere inside of the color box, but even if you shift it just a tiny bit toward any of these areas, you are already adding a highlight, an accent, or a shadow. It's all about how far you move from your base. The higher the shift, the stronger the effect. Inside the color box speaker, darker tones move down and slightly to the right like an L curve, and on the color wheel, reds shift towards purple as they darken and blues shift towards deep navy tones. Subtlety is key. Overdo it and your lighting breaks. And I know there are different types of color pickers, so the sections will probably look a little bit different. So just remember that the colors closer to the white color, they are highlights. The ones that are closer to the black color, they're shadows, and between the middle and grays, they are like base colors or shadows, or the more saturated it is an accent color. Which brings me to the topic, what are accent colors? Now, when I say accent colors, what I mean are those little color punches that guide the viewer's attention. They're not the main color of your piece, they're the spices that make everything else pop. For example, if your artwork is mostly blue and gray, a small touch of orange or red instantly draws the eye. That's your accent. You can use them to highlight areas of focus, balance out your palette, or just make the overall render feel more lively. In short, accent colors are what give your illustration personality. They are like the final brushstroke that says, yeah, this piece is done. Now, no matter which coloring method you use, two extra touches make your art pop. The shadow accents and highlight glows. The shadow accent sits along the Terminator line, the edge where light turns into shadow. Instead of leaving it gray, tint it slightly, warm reds or oranges under the sunlight, cool blues under moonlight. I like using an overlay layer for this and softly blurring it into the shadow. It instantly brings back saturation and life, especially if your value's first renders looks flat. For highlights, don't be so scared to go a little wild. Paint slightly outside of the lines. A subtle glow splaying out adds atmosphere and makes your piece feel alive. Now that's the foundation of shading and rendering, from light direction and ambient occlusion all the way to values, color, and the Terminator. And honestly, that's almost everything that I know inside of shading and rendering. Everything that I shared here is what I personally use in my own art, so I really hope it helps you understand things better, or at least gives you a few new tools to play with. And if you learned something today, maybe leave a like or drop a comment or share what you'd like to see next. Thanks a lot for watching, and as always, keep practicing, keep experimenting, and I'll see you in the next one.